"You're not supposed to be here," Clara Belmont said, her voice sliding through the room like ice across glass. Yet Zoe Carter didn't flinch. The office lights reflected sharply off the polished mahogany table, throwing streaks of brilliance across Ethan Hawthorne's face as he leaned back in his chair, coffee untouched, eyes narrowing subtly at Zoe's calm posture. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, painting the otherwise tense boardroom with an almost surreal glow. Zoe's hands rested lightly on a stack of reports, her pulse steady despite the weight of observation from two powerful figures who had underestimated her presence. Clara's smirk was thin, deliberate, meant to unnerve, but Zoe had learned early in life that confidence was silent, patience measured, and perception sharp. Her gaze drifted, almost imperceptibly, toward a corner of the office where the faint blinking of a camera barely caught the eye. A subtle shift, unnoticed by Clara, but Zoe's instincts flagged it immediately. Ethan's attention wavered for a split second, caught between sipping the coffee and observing the unspoken dialogue unfolding before him. Zoe leaned in slightly, her voice low and precise, carrying only to Ethan. "There's a camera in your office. Someone's been watching every move." The air thickened, the tension palpable as Clara's laugh, soft and contained, attempted to reclaim dominance, yet it faltered, just enough for Ethan to notice the slight twitch of her hand on the armrest. Zoe's eyes, steady and unwavering, held Ethan's, transmitting the certainty of her words, the unassailable clarity of a truth she could not ignore. Ethan pressed a finger against his phone screen, checking the feed silently, his breath measured as the display revealed the hidden device, confirming Zoe's observation. Clara's composed exterior cracked subtly, a fleeting reflection of apprehension crossing her features. Zoe remained poised, standing straight, shoulders squared, a quiet defiance in the set of her jaw, the faintest gleam of resolve lighting her expression. The room's atmosphere shifted imperceptibly, yet the change was absolute. Authority, arrogance, and appearances began to bend under the weight of revelation. Ethan's gaze hardened, comprehension dawning as he processed the confirmation of Zoe's words, the implications of secrecy and deception swirling within the boundaries of the space. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the subtle reactions of Clara, noting the small falter in posture, the hesitation in her fingers, the slight catch in her breath. Zoe's whisper, nearly drowned by the ambient hum of the office air conditioning, had triggered an irreversible recalibration of perception. For the first time, Ethan saw the layers of the situation unfold, the truth unmasked in the quiet strength of the one he had overlooked. Clara's attempts at reclaiming control became increasingly futile, her dominance challenged, her composure subtly failing under scrutiny. Zoe's presence, almost ethereal in its quiet confidence, anchored the scene, a reminder that power was not only measured in wealth or status, but in awareness, courage, and moral clarity. Ethan's jaw tightened as he considered the extent of what had been hidden from him, the implications of the camera, the surveillance, and the web of assumptions he had allowed to persist. Zoe's expression remained unchanged, her patience absolute, her perception acute, the weight of observation translating into influence without a word raised. As Ethan's eyes returned to the screen, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, understanding, trust, and a shift in dynamic that would not soon be reversed. The office, bathed in the soft gold of morning light, seemed to stretch, seconds elongated as the revelation settled into place, the quiet suspense of what would come next coiling tightly in the air. Clara's breathing became perceptible, subtle but telling, her attempt to mask the crack in her façade failing against the incontrovertible evidence. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound low, controlled, carrying both the gravity of realization and the anticipation of confrontation. Zoe's whisper had catalyzed the turning point, a pivot in narrative, a reshaping of perception, as all three figures now navigated the precarious tension between knowledge and deception, authority and observation. The camera's tiny red light continued its quiet blink, a silent witness to the unfolding reckoning. The room suspended in a delicate balance of revelation and restraint, the final resolution hovering just beyond the next deliberate breath, inviting questions, anticipation, and the promise of a full unveiling that had yet to come. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows fill the space. The soft amber light from the early afternoon sun reflecting off the polished conference table, highlighting the subtle lines of contemplation on his face. Zoe stood still, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her posture calm yet assertive, the faint gleam of determination in her eyes, betraying the quiet storm of observation within. Clara shifted slightly, the click of her heels on the marble floor echoing, a fragile attempt to reclaim composure as the screen on Ethan's phone displayed the live feed from the camera, the small red light blinking methodically, a steady pulse of revelation. Ethan's finger hovered, tracing a line of thought, weighing the implications, considering every angle as Zoe's steady gaze met his, a silent confirmation of the truth he was beginning to accept. The room seemed to stretch, seconds elongated, the air thick with unspoken tension as the balance of power subtly began to tilt. Clara's voice, careful and measured, attempted to assert control. "Ethan, this is hardly," but she stopped herself mid-sentence, noticing the faint shift in his expression, a tightened jaw, a steadying of the breath, a recalibration of attention that signaled he had already absorbed the full meaning of the discovery. Zoe's calm remained unbroken, every motion measured, her eyes flicking once to the camera and back to Ethan, the precision of her observation undeniable, an anchor of clarity in the storm of uncertainty. Ethan slowly set his coffee aside, the porcelain cup resting lightly on the table, barely making a sound, a subtle signal of focus, his mind processing the layers of intention, deception, and oversight that had led to this quiet confrontation. Clara attempted another step forward, adjusting a stack of papers as if to redirect attention, yet Ethan's eyes never left Zoe, the recognition of insight, courage, and perceptive accuracy slowly dawning. Zoe tilted her head slightly, a single eyebrow raised, and the faintest smile curved her lips, an acknowledgement of the shift in perception, the invisible thread of influence she had quietly woven through observation and deduction. The camera feed continued its relentless blink, a silent witness, capturing movements, gestures, and reactions, translating into an unspoken narrative of transparency, a record of truth unaltered by assertion or intent. Ethan's voice finally broke the hush, calm yet layered with depth. "Zoe, you saw this before I did." A simple acknowledgement, yet weighted with the recognition of competence, foresight, and a subtle realignment of authority that had been imperceptibly underway since Zoe's initial whisper. Clara's hands tightened slightly on the arms of her chair, the slight tremor a subtle testament to the unseen recalibration of influence, the quiet realization that her carefully curated control was subject to the clarity and presence of another. Zoe's posture remained unchanged, a quiet sentinel of perceptive acuity, eyes steady, the soft glow of sunlight catching the highlights in her hair, her expression a blend of serenity and unyielding attention. Ethan gestured toward the display on his phone, his movements deliberate, measured, a silent communication bridging understanding between observation and action. Clara's attempt to speak was met with a raised hand, gentle yet authoritative, and the room fell silent once more, the balance of attention fully shifted, anticipation hanging in the air as though the space itself held its breath, waiting for the next motion, the next decision, the revelation that would redefine understanding and authority. Zoe's whisper had not only revealed a hidden truth, but also subtly reshaped the power dynamic, her quiet confidence and perceptive insight acting as an unseen current beneath the surface of wealth, influence, and carefully maintained appearances. Ethan's gaze returned to the feed, eyes scanning for detail, movement, anything that might indicate intent or deception. Every flicker of light, every shadow within the room magnified in significance, the awareness that what had been hidden was now illuminated, creating a tension both delicate and profound. Clara, sensing the irrevocable shift, adjusted her stance, the soft click of heels again, this time hesitant, tentative, as if acknowledging the invisible pivot of authority that had occurred. Zoe's eyes remained steady, unwavering, her presence a testament to observation, patience, and measured influence. Every breath, every micro-expression carefully attuned to the flow of the room, maintaining control without overt assertion. The afternoon light shifted subtly, casting long, narrow reflections across the conference table, catching the polished surface in sharp lines that mirrored the precise, unbroken focus of Ethan's attention and Zoe's unwavering composure. The quiet rhythm of acknowledgement, understanding, and recalibration permeated the space, the soft hum of distant traffic a backdrop to the subtle, yet powerful shift in perception and authority. Every movement, every glance, every blink contributed to a tapestry of insight and recognition. The camera's persistent blink a metronome marking the progression of clarity, awareness, and the slow, deliberate uncovering of intent and truth. A silent orchestration of observation, patience, and quiet influence that would shape the decisions and actions to follow. Ethan sat back, the tension in the office gradually easing as the reality of Zoe Carter's observation settled in. The camera feed continued its soft blink, capturing the minutiae of expressions, subtle gestures, and the shifting dynamics between the three occupants of the room. Zoe remained poised, standing near the edge of the polished mahogany table, her posture firm, a quiet sentinel whose calm clarity had begun to redefine the space around her. Clara Belmont fidgeted slightly, rearranging papers on the table, her precise movements betraying a growing awareness that control was no longer hers to wield. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast long reflections across the conference room floor, dancing across the surface in geometric lines that mirrored the invisible threads of influence Zoe had begun to weave. Ethan's gaze moved from the screen to Clara, noting the change in her demeanor, the subtle flattening of a previously confident posture, the faint tightening around her lips, and the slow blinking that seemed to measure hesitation and doubt. Zoe's eyes never left Ethan, steady, deliberate, communicating through the unspoken language of observation and assured understanding. She adjusted the stack of documents she had been holding, tapping a single folder lightly with her finger, a soft yet commanding gesture that drew Ethan's attention fully back to the evidence before them. Clara attempted a carefully measured response, her voice smooth and controlled. "Ethan, perhaps this is a misunderstanding." But the weight of certainty in Ethan's eyes silenced the sentence before it could fully take shape. The room held in a suspended moment where no assertion could overcome clarity. Zoe's steady breathing punctuated the silence, the faint rustle of her clothing as she shifted her stance a subtle reminder that she was fully present, fully aware, and unshakable in her composure. Ethan leaned forward slightly, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, eyes scanning every micro-expression, every indication of intent, every subtle shift of Clara's body language, as the realization of her duplicity became undeniable. The light reflected off the polished wood, catching the highlights in Zoe's hair and casting a soft glow that emphasized the contrast between her calm certainty and Clara's tentative movements. The camera continued to blink, silent and impartial, a witness to the unfolding recalibration of authority within the room. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound deliberate, measured, signaling recognition, reflection, and the beginning of recalibrated trust. Zoe's subtle nod acknowledged the shift, an unspoken affirmation that the truth had been seen, confirmed, and that the balance of understanding had been irrevocably altered. Clara's attempt to regain composure faltered again, her hands tightening slightly on the papers, a quiet testament to the slow, inexorable shift in influence. Ethan's eyes returned to the feed, his mind processing the implications, considering next steps, and measuring the weight of insight Zoe had brought into the room. The interplay of observation, quiet assertion, and careful attention to detail had created a new equilibrium, a nuanced realignment that neither wealth nor position alone could dictate. Zoe's stance remained unchanged, a beacon of composure and perceptive acuity, every blink, every small gesture a demonstration of clarity and confidence. Ethan's subtle movements, slight nods, and deliberate gestures indicated that recognition, trust, and recalibrated authority had taken root. The sunlight shifted slightly, elongating the shadows across the floor, emphasizing the quiet transformation in the room, the subtle but absolute shift in understanding and acknowledgement. Clara's soft exhale betrayed her awareness that her influence had been carefully and irreversibly challenged. The office, bathed in the gentle glow of afternoon light, seemed to hold its breath with the three figures at the table, suspended in the delicate balance between revelation and consequence, observation and action. Every detail, from the camera's small red blink to the polished surface of the table, contributed to the silent orchestration of understanding, authority, and clarity. Ethan's gaze lingered on the feed, the evidence undeniable, the reassessment complete, and the room quiet but charged with the subtle hum of revelation, patience, and unspoken acknowledgement of Zoe's perceptive power. Clara shifted once more, lightly brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, signaling the final moments of hesitation before the next decisive move would be made. Zoe's calm remained unbroken, her measured breathing and precise awareness serving as the anchor around which the unspoken recalibration of authority, observation, and understanding revolved, each second elongating in quiet intensity as the full significance of insight, awareness, and revelation settled firmly into place, the office suspended in a careful balance of truth, patience, and measured power. Ethan pressed a hand gently against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingers, grounding himself as the implications of what Zoe Carter had revealed settled fully in his mind. The camera feed blinked steadily, a silent witness to the subtle shifts in expression, the tightening of shoulders, the micro-movements that conveyed more than words ever could. Clara Belmont's previously confident posture had softened, the faintest furrow appearing between her brows as she recalibrated her understanding of the room, her dominance quietly eroded by the precision and certainty Zoe projected. Zoe remained perfectly still, her eyes scanning the space, not missing a single detail, every gesture she made deliberate yet understated, her presence commanding attention without a single raised voice. The sunlight shifted slowly through the large windows, casting angular patterns across the polished floor, illuminating the lines of tension etched into the room, highlighting the contrast between authority and insight, arrogance and awareness. Ethan's gaze lingered on Zoe, a subtle recognition passing through his expression, a combination of admiration, surprise, and careful consideration, as if he were measuring the weight of truth against every assumption he had previously held. Clara shifted slightly, moving papers with a controlled precision, attempting to regain composure, yet each movement was now measured against Zoe's unwavering poise, the air between them charged with a silent acknowledgement of shifting power. The hum of the office air conditioning, soft and constant, framed the scene, every small sound magnified in the stillness, the click of a pen, the faint shuffle of papers, the quiet intake of breath, all contributing to the layering of suspense and anticipation. Zoe adjusted the folder she had been holding, a slight tap against the corner signaling the attention of Ethan, an unspoken communication of clarity and direction, emphasizing the thoroughness of her observation and the meticulousness of her perception. Ethan's hand hovered over the phone, tracing lines on the screen, noting details that had previously gone unconsidered, recalibrating his understanding of the situation, the subtle nuances of movement, the positioning of the camera, and the reactions captured by its lens. Clara's soft exhale, barely perceptible, signaled an internal acknowledgement of the subtle recalibration of influence, the awareness that control had quietly shifted in a manner neither forceful nor overt. Zoe's stance remained unchanged, steady and deliberate, her focus unbroken, the faint light catching the edges of her hair and casting subtle highlights that accentuated her calm vigilance. Ethan finally moved his gaze from the screen to Clara, noting the tremor in her hand as she reached for a document, the slight hesitation in her foot as it shifted beneath the table, each small signal a testament to the quiet unraveling of her composed façade. The sunlight shifted further, elongating shadows across the floor, emphasizing the spatial relationship between the three figures and the subtle orchestration of awareness and control that had quietly taken hold. Ethan's subtle nod, barely perceptible, confirmed a decision had formed, recognition of insight and clarity firmly established, a silent acknowledgement of the reliability, observation, and decisive presence that Zoe had brought to the situation. Clara adjusted once more, her movements precise but tentative, each step measured, a reflection of the recognition that the room's dynamics had fundamentally shifted in ways not immediately reversible. Zoe's subtle smile, slight and controlled, indicated the acknowledgement of influence realized without the need for overt assertion, the quiet power of perception and moral clarity asserting itself in the space. Ethan's fingers hovered above the phone again, his eyes sweeping the room, calculating, assessing, understanding that the moment was both a culmination and a prelude, a pivot point in which attention, observation, and insight had changed the equation irreversibly. The office remained bathed in the warm afternoon light, every reflection, shadow, and subtle flicker of movement contributing to the layering of understanding, authority, and the measured balance of influence. The red blink of the camera persisted, silent and impartial, a reminder that observation was continuous, that the space was under scrutiny, and that every decision, every pause, every subtle gesture was a part of the ongoing orchestration of awareness and consequence. Ethan's breathing deepened, measured and deliberate, signaling a full comprehension of the information, the subtle acknowledgement of Zoe's role in the recalibration of authority, and the anticipation of the steps to follow in addressing the revelations captured by the camera. Zoe remained composed, every micro-expression and slight movement deliberate, a quiet statement of certainty and the invisible recalibration of the room's hierarchy, marking a slow but inexorable shift in perception, influence, and acknowledgement that would continue to unfold beyond the immediate moment. Ethan's eyes traced every subtle detail across the office, the sunlight shifting as mid-afternoon cast long golden streaks across the polished marble floor, illuminating the faint reflections of furniture, glass, and the three figures whose interactions had begun to redefine the balance of authority. Zoe Carter's posture remained calm, a quiet confidence radiating through the measured alignment of her shoulders, the precise placement of her hands on the edge of the table, and the controlled, deliberate expression on her face. Clara Belmont shifted slightly, the soft scrape of her chair legs against the marble floor emphasizing the tension that had begun to settle into the room, the subtle contraction of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, and the careful rearrangement of papers, all indicators that her composure was under scrutiny and quietly unraveling. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the feed from the camera, observing the small, steady blink of the device as if it were a heartbeat of the office, a pulse measuring the truth of the situation, the honesty of observation, and the precision of Zoe's awareness. The quiet hum of the office's air conditioning provided a soft ambient backdrop, blending with the faint scratch of pen on paper, the rustle of folders, and the whisper of Zoe's movements, each sound magnified by the stillness of the room and the collective anticipation of what was being revealed. Zoe's eyes briefly flicked to Clara, then back to Ethan, transmitting clarity without words, her subtle nods indicating not just the presence of evidence, but the necessity for careful attention, discernment, and deliberate action. Ethan's breathing deepened, each inhale measured, each exhale deliberate, as he processed the implications of Zoe's observation, the hidden truths that had come to light, and the recalibration of judgment that had quietly begun within him. The sunlight caught the edge of the polished table, highlighting the reflective surfaces and drawing attention to the intricate dance of observation, awareness, and silent communication between Ethan and Zoe, an unspoken acknowledgement of competence, foresight, and the quiet exertion of influence through perception rather than declaration. Clara shifted again, her hands brushing lightly against the papers, a subtle attempt to regain control, yet every movement was now filtered through the awareness of Zoe's unyielding focus and Ethan's measured attention, creating a delicate balance of tension and observation that hung in the air. Zoe's subtle smile, restrained and composed, hinted at the effectiveness of her insight without breaking the careful equilibrium she had established, each micro-expression and slight gesture contributing to the quiet assertion of clarity, moral awareness, and measured influence. Ethan's hand hovered momentarily over the table, fingertips brushing lightly against the wood, a physical anchor as he considered the next step, the subtle cues he had absorbed, and the weight of unspoken understanding now firmly established between him and Zoe. Clara's controlled breathing, faint yet perceptible, indicated her growing acknowledgement of the subtle shift in authority, the quiet surrender of dominance that had been so carefully curated, now challenged by presence, insight, and the careful articulation of observation. The camera's blinking red light continued to mark each second, a silent sentinel observing minute movements, gestures, and expressions that told a story far beyond words, translating into a narrative of awareness, trust, and recalibrated influence. Ethan finally exhaled, long and deliberate, signaling comprehension, acknowledgement, and the silent acceptance of Zoe's role in reshaping the perception of events within the office, the room's atmosphere thick with quiet intensity, anticipation, and the weight of observation. Zoe's stance remained unchanged, precise and deliberate, every slight movement communicating focus, patience, and moral clarity, reinforcing the subtle but powerful realignment of authority and perception. The afternoon sunlight shifted again, elongating shadows across the marble floor, emphasizing the three-dimensional space and the spatial relationships, highlighting how observation, awareness, and measured action could influence dynamics, perception, and ultimately the unfolding of truth. Ethan's subtle nods, soft exhalations, and attentive gestures indicated that trust, acknowledgement, and recognition had been fully recalibrated, a new equilibrium forming in which awareness, insight, and quiet confidence determined influence more than assertion, position, or status. Clara adjusted slightly, a careful, tentative gesture, her awareness of the shift in dynamics now undeniable, her posture reflecting the recognition of a balance that had been subtly, but irrevocably, altered by Zoe's careful observation and steady presence. The office held a quiet, intense rhythm, the hum of the city outside faint in comparison to the delicate orchestration of awareness, attention, and authority that now defined the room, every micro-movement, shadow, and reflection contributing to the understanding that clarity, insight, and patience had quietly asserted themselves, creating a pivot from which the unfolding story would continue. Ethan's attention lingered on the subtle reflections of sunlight dancing across the conference table, the golden rays highlighting the meticulous order of folders and documents while emphasizing the quiet intensity that filled the office. Zoe Carter remained poised, her stance unwavering, eyes tracking the minute details of Clara Belmont's shifting posture, every blink, every adjustment of a hand or foot translating into unspoken signals that the room seemed to echo back with a soft hum of awareness. Clara's composure wavered subtly, her breath slightly shallower, her movements more deliberate as she rearranged papers and smoothed a crease in her skirt, an unconscious acknowledgement of the recalibration of influence occurring around her. Ethan's gaze, fixed and deliberate, traced the flow of attention from Zoe to the camera feed, noting the precise angle of the device, the faint blink of red, and the accuracy with which Zoe had identified its presence. The office felt suspended, each second stretching, the ambient hum of the air conditioning blending with the soft scrape of a chair leg and the subtle shift of fabric as Zoe repositioned herself slightly, a movement measured and precise, signaling observation and careful control without breaking the calm. The sunlight shifted further, casting elongated shadows across the polished floor, the reflections creating an almost cinematic geometry that mirrored the intricate interplay of perception, awareness, and authority between the three occupants. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound deliberate, a controlled release that punctuated the tension and acknowledged the unfolding understanding, the quiet yet undeniable pivot in dynamics that Zoe's insight had precipitated. Zoe's subtle nods, her micro-expressions, the minimal yet deliberate adjustments of her hands and posture reinforced her quiet command of attention, a soft but persistent assertion of clarity that shaped the room's atmosphere without a single raised voice. Clara's eyes flicked toward the camera feed, noting Ethan's attentive scrutiny and Zoe's unwavering focus, the subtle tightening of her lips betraying the internal acknowledgement that the balance had shifted, that perception and understanding no longer relied solely on position or status. The gentle hum of computers, the muted tick of a distant clock, and the soft ambient noise of the city below framed the scene, amplifying the concentration and attentiveness that permeated the space. each small sound carrying weight in the quiet orchestration of observation and realization. Ethan's hand traced lightly across the surface of the table, fingertips brushing the polished wood as he considered the unfolding sequence, the implications of Zoe's observation, and the necessity of deliberate action, every motion intentional and measured. Zoe's steady gaze met his once more, conveying reassurance, precision, and the subtle influence of her insight, her presence reinforcing the newly established equilibrium, a quiet yet compelling testament to the power of observation and moral clarity. Clara's subtle movements, the faint shift of weight from one foot to the other, the careful placement of hands on folders, all communicated awareness, a tacit recognition of the effectiveness of Zoe's methodical attention and unshakable composure. The sunlight shifted again, elongating reflections across the marble floor, highlighting the interplay of shadow and light, the mirrored dynamics of control, insight, and awareness that defined the room in that suspended moment. Ethan's exhalation, deep and deliberate, marked acknowledgement, reflection, and measured acceptance of the new understanding, a subtle realignment of trust and perspective anchored by Zoe's perceptive presence. The camera's persistent blink served as a metronome, marking the progression of clarity, observation, and awareness, every fraction of a second a testament to the unfolding recalibration of perception and influence. Zoe remained centered, poised, and deliberate, each subtle movement reinforcing her quiet yet decisive impact, the soft glow of sunlight catching the edges of her hair and casting nuanced highlights that accentuated her focused vigilance. The office, filled with the quiet interplay of reflection, awareness, and deliberate attention, seemed to hold its breath as the invisible threads of insight and comprehension continued to weave, a tension both delicate and profound, signaling the transition toward the next movement in the carefully measured unfolding of truth, observation, and acknowledgement. Ethan's eyes lifted from the camera feed, tracing the subtle angles of sunlight shifting across the floor, catching reflections on the polished wood, as if the room itself were highlighting the new equilibrium that had been quietly established. Zoe Carter remained steadfast, her stance firm and composed, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, the faintest glint of determination in her eyes conveying calm authority without a word spoken. Clara Belmont's movements slowed, deliberate, each subtle adjustment of a hand or foot measured against the invisible but undeniable influence Zoe had asserted through observation and insight. The hum of the air conditioning provided a soft, constant backdrop, emphasizing the silence that had settled over the room, punctuated only by the subtle rustle of papers and the faint flicker of the camera's red light, each blink marking the passage of attention, awareness, and understanding. Ethan leaned slightly forward, fingertips tracing the polished surface of the table as he considered the implications of the evidence, the accuracy of Zoe's perception, and the subtle but irreversible shift in authority that had occurred. Zoe's eyes met his, steady and unwavering, transmitting clarity, confidence, and the quiet assertion of insight that had begun to redefine the dynamics of the office. Clara adjusted her posture, a slight straightening of her back, a controlled inhale, an unconscious acknowledgement that her composure had been challenged and that influence had been recalibrated by observation rather than assertion. The light shifted again through the tall windows, elongating shadows across the floor and creating a geometric play of reflection and angle that mirrored the unfolding recalibration of understanding, trust, and awareness between the three figures. Ethan's gaze lingered on Zoe, recognition softening the lines of concentration on his face, an acknowledgement that her presence had subtly reshaped the perception of the room and the decisions that would follow. Zoe's slight nod, almost imperceptible, reinforced the alignment of observation, clarity, and influence she had carefully maintained, each subtle movement amplifying her quiet authority. Clara's hands adjusted lightly on the folders before her, the faintest trace of tension in her fingers betraying the awareness that control had shifted, that her previous assumptions no longer held unchallenged. The office, bathed in the warm afternoon light, seemed to stretch, the space between shadows and reflections emphasizing the careful interplay of attention, insight, and deliberate understanding that now governed the room. Ethan's breathing deepened, slow and deliberate, a physical acknowledgement of comprehension, trust, and the careful assessment of the unfolding dynamic. Zoe's calm remained absolute, a quiet anchor of awareness and perceptive clarity, her presence subtly directing the flow of observation, recognition, and measured influence without overt assertion. The subtle movement of Clara's eyes, the slight tilt of her head, the careful placement of her hands on papers, all indicated an internal recognition that her control had been quietly recalibrated, that influence now rested in part on observation, clarity, and moral acuity rather than position alone. Ethan's exhale, measured and deliberate, punctuated the room with a quiet sense of acknowledgement, a recognition of the pivot that had occurred and the subtle restructuring of perception, trust, and authority. The camera's blinking red light continued its unrelenting cadence, marking each second as a witness to clarity, careful observation, and the quiet, deliberate reassessment of the power dynamic. Zoe's posture remained firm, composed, every micro-expression and subtle movement reinforcing the quiet influence she had established, her calm vigilance a guide for both Ethan's judgment and Clara's recalibrated understanding. The sunlight shifted once more, casting long, angled reflections across the polished floor, highlighting the layered interplay of observation, awareness, and deliberate decision-making that now defined the office. Ethan's gaze swept slowly from the camera to Clara and back to Zoe, a sequence of consideration, recognition, and acknowledgement that mirrored the quiet orchestration of insight, patience, and moral clarity unfolding in real time. Clara's soft, measured breath and tentative gestures indicated the gradual acceptance of this recalibrated dynamic, the unspoken understanding that influence and trust had shifted in subtle but irreversible ways. Zoe's presence remained unwavering, a constant of perceptive authority, careful judgment, and quiet confidence, each subtle shift of posture, blink, and gesture reinforcing the recalibrated equilibrium. The office held its breath in the soft glow of late afternoon, shadows stretching and reflecting across the polished surfaces, emphasizing the deliberate, measured interplay of observation, awareness, and moral clarity that would guide the moments to come. The subtle power of insight quietly asserting itself, shaping the space, the decisions, and the understanding of everyone within it. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight, his eyes scanning the subtle play of light and shadow across the office as the late afternoon sun angled through the tall windows, highlighting the polished surfaces and reflecting off the edges of folders and documents with precise brilliance. Zoe Carter remained motionless near the corner of the table, her posture impeccable, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on the polished surface, every micro-movement deliberate, every blink a signal of calm vigilance and unspoken command. Clara Belmont adjusted her stance, the gentle scrape of her heels against the marble floor accentuating the growing tension and the careful recalibration of awareness that had begun to define the dynamics in the room. Ethan's gaze moved between the camera feed and Zoe, noting the alignment of observation, insight, and quiet authority she had established, the subtle recognition of truth etched across his expression as he absorbed the implications of her discovery. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of papers, and the distant murmur of the city below, each sound amplified by the stillness and attentiveness that had settled over the office. Zoe's eyes briefly met Ethan's, a subtle nod of confirmation passing between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of clarity, trust, and the recalibration of perception that had taken place, every movement intentional yet understated, reinforcing her influence without overt assertion. Clara's hands moved slowly across the folders before her, the slight tightening of her fingers and the measured shift of her weight signaling the internal recognition that her composure and control were no longer the sole determinants of authority within the space. The sunlight continued to shift, elongating the reflections across the marble floor and polished table, highlighting the delicate balance between observation, awareness, and the subtle assertion of influence that now governed the room. Ethan exhaled deeply, deliberate and measured, his fingers tracing a light path across the edge of the table, grounding himself as he considered the flow of events, the precision of Zoe's insight, and the quiet recalibration of judgment and trust that had emerged. Zoe's calm remained unwavering, her presence a stabilizing anchor, her slight movements measured to maintain attention and clarity, every gesture reinforcing the perceptive power she wielded without speaking a word. Clara's eyes flicked toward the camera feed, then back to Ethan and Zoe, the subtle widening of her eyes and the gentle lifting of her eyebrows betraying the awareness that the balance of authority had shifted. That observation and clarity now guided perception more than position or status. The room seemed suspended, each second stretched by the weight of anticipation, the interplay of reflection and light, and the quiet orchestration of understanding, awareness, and moral clarity that defined the moment. Ethan's gaze lingered on Zoe, recognition and subtle admiration mixing with thoughtful calculation, his mind tracing the sequence of discovery, observation, and insight, appreciating the depth of perception and the quiet power she had brought into the space. Zoe's slight, controlled smile reinforced her calm confidence, the minimal tilt of her head conveying measured understanding and the unspoken influence she had asserted. Clara's soft intake of breath and tentative adjustments of posture marked the acknowledgement of subtle authority, the recognition that influence had quietly shifted, measured not by position or volume, but by observation, patience, and insight. The camera's persistent red blink continued as a silent witness, each beat a reminder of transparency, accuracy, and the unfolding recognition of truth, capturing every nuanced expression, subtle gesture, and careful motion as the room's dynamic continued to evolve. Ethan's fingers hovered above the table, tracing thoughtful lines as he considered the implications, the weight of observation, and the measured steps necessary to proceed, each action deliberate and precise. Zoe's presence remained steadfast, her composed stance and unbroken gaze reinforcing the quiet but firm recalibration of the room, highlighting the power of careful attention, moral clarity, and perceptive influence. The sunlight shifted yet again, stretching shadows and reflections across the office, emphasizing the layered interplay of awareness, insight, and deliberate judgment that now defined the atmosphere, every detail contributing to the subtle yet undeniable reshaping of understanding, trust, and the measured assertion of authority in the space. Ethan leaned forward slightly, the soft glow of the afternoon sun illuminating the edges of the conference table and casting elongated reflections across the polished marble floor, the air dense with the quiet tension of observation and unspoken understanding. Zoe Carter's posture remained steady and assured, every subtle movement calculated, her hands lightly resting on the table, fingertips brushing the smooth surface in a silent rhythm that reinforced her presence, her calm vigilance a counterpoint to the charged atmosphere. Clara Belmont shifted uneasily in her chair, the faint scrape of her heels against the floor punctuating the stillness, the subtle tightening of her jaw and the careful alignment of her papers betraying her growing awareness that her authority was being quietly questioned, observed, and redefined. Ethan's eyes scanned the camera feed once more, noting the precise angles, the faint red blink, and the reflections in the glass that mirrored Zoe's deliberate assessment of the room, her insight shaping his perception and subtly guiding his consideration. The office felt suspended in time, each second drawn out by the interplay of light, shadow, and reflection, every detail amplified by the meticulous attention being paid to the nuances of posture, gaze, and gesture. Zoe tilted her head slightly, a micro-expression of acknowledgement passing between her and Ethan, the silent communication of awareness and clarity that had steadily altered the balance of perception in the room. Clara's hands adjusted ever so slightly, flattening papers and shifting a folder, each movement hesitant and measured, revealing the internal recognition that control had been subtly but irrevocably recalibrated. The soft hum of the air conditioning blended with the distant murmur of city traffic, the faintest scratch of a pen, and the gentle flutter of Zoe's document corners, creating a layered soundscape in which every subtle auditory cue marked the passage of observation, reflection, and decision-making. Ethan's breathing was deliberate, measured, a grounding presence in the delicate web of perception, each exhale punctuating the subtle changes in authority, trust, and acknowledgement that had taken root. Zoe's calm and unbroken stance reinforced the quiet command of attention, her micro-movements and measured glances projecting influence without the need for speech, demonstrating the power of observation, clarity, and moral confidence. Clara's eyes, shifting subtly between Ethan, Zoe, and the camera feed, reflected the gradual internalization of the new dynamic, her previously assured composure tempered by the undeniable precision and insight Zoe had brought into the office. The sunlight continued to move through the windows, elongating shadows across the floor, reflecting off the polished surfaces, accentuating the three-dimensional interplay of power, perception, and observation that now defined the atmosphere. Ethan's fingers brushed lightly over the edge of the table, a tactile acknowledgement of the weight of insight, awareness, and responsibility that had emerged from Zoe's careful attention to detail. Zoe's eyes flicked once to the camera feed, then back to Ethan, her slight nod a reinforcement of the truth she had uncovered, her composed demeanor a subtle assertion of the recalibrated equilibrium within the office. Clara's measured inhale, the shift of her shoulders, and the careful repositioning of her hands indicated a conscious acknowledgement of the subtle, yet powerful change that had taken place. The recognition that influence now extended beyond titles or status into the realm of perception, clarity, and moral awareness. The camera's steady blinking continued as a silent observer, capturing each micro-expression, subtle gesture, and calculated movement, reinforcing the quiet orchestration of truth, understanding, and deliberate awareness that Zoe had catalyzed. Ethan's gaze returned to Zoe, a blend of measured respect and acknowledgement, the quiet understanding that her presence, insight, and careful observation had transformed the room's dynamic, subtly shifting influence, perception, and trust. The office remained bathed in the warm, diffused light of late afternoon, shadows stretching and converging across polished surfaces, emphasizing the layered interplay of observation, awareness, and the deliberate recalibration of understanding, with Zoe's poised and deliberate presence anchoring the silent, yet profound transformation of authority, perception, and insight that would guide the next steps in the unfolding moment. Ethan's gaze sharpened as he leaned closer to the camera feed, the soft afternoon light casting long, narrow reflections across the polished marble floor, highlighting the subtle movements of shadows and the meticulous arrangement of folders and documents. Zoe Carter remained perfectly composed, her posture upright, hands lightly resting on the edge of the table, every micro-movement intentional, her eyes scanning Clara Belmont with precise focus, reading the minute cues of hesitation, adjustment, and controlled breath that revealed the shifting balance of authority. Clara's posture had stiffened slightly, the faint creasing of her brow and the subtle tightening of her lips betraying the inner acknowledgement that the carefully maintained control she had relied upon was quietly unraveling under the weight of Zoe's perceptive insight. The hum of the office air conditioning provided a constant, almost rhythmic backdrop, mingling with the soft scratch of pen against paper, the slight flutter of document corners, and the gentle movement of clothing fabric, each sound amplified in the stillness, marking the passage of observation, recognition, and contemplation. Ethan's hands rested lightly on the polished table, fingertips brushing against the wood as he absorbed the unfolding information, measuring the implications of Zoe's insight, and considering the delicate recalibration of judgment and trust now firmly established. Zoe's eyes met his briefly, the faintest nod signaling acknowledgement, clarity, and a quiet assertion of perceptive authority, her calm composure underscoring the subtle shift that had occurred within the office dynamic. Clara's fingers flexed subtly on the edge of a folder, her movements precise yet tentative, a soft, almost imperceptible recognition that her previously unquestioned control had been challenged and that influence now extended beyond titles and position into the realm of observation, insight, and moral clarity. The late afternoon sunlight angled through the tall windows, elongating the shadows across the polished floor, catching reflections in the glass and metal of the office furniture, and emphasizing the interplay of awareness, patience, and measured authority that had begun to define the room. Ethan exhaled slowly, each breath deliberate, a grounding rhythm against the quiet intensity, marking acknowledgement reflection, and consideration as the understanding of events crystallized. Zoe's presence remained unbroken, her stance deliberate and commanding through the subtleties of posture and measured gaze, reinforcing the delicate but undeniable influence she had established. Clara shifted once more, sliding a paper slightly forward and adjusting her hands on the folders. Gestures now filtered through awareness of the unseen but palpable shift in authority, the acknowledgement that observation, precision, and insight had quietly recalibrated the dynamics. The camera's faint red blink continued as a silent witness, its unyielding cadence highlighting every gesture, blink, and measured breath, translating each subtle movement into a narrative of clarity, truth, and measured influence. Ethan's gaze swept from the feedback to the two women, registering every nuance, every shift in micro-expression, and the delicate interplay of acknowledgement, trust, and recalibrated perception that Zoe's quiet assertiveness had established. Zoe's slight, controlled movements, a tilt of the head, a subtle lift of the eyebrows, a measured adjustment of hands, all reinforced her unwavering composure, her presence acting as the anchor for the room's evolving dynamic, her insight shaping the way observation and authority intertwined. The office, filled with the interplay of sunlight, reflection, and shadow, seemed to hold its breath, each detail magnified, each second stretched, underscoring the careful balance of perception, attention, and moral clarity. Ethan's fingers traced gentle lines across the polished table, a physical representation of his thought process, absorbing the implications of Zoe's discernment, acknowledging the recalibration of influence, and preparing for the next steps informed by insight and observation. Clara's careful inhalation, the faint shift in her posture, and the subtle repositioning of hands and shoulders marked her ongoing recognition of the subtle but powerful changes in authority, the awareness that influence and trust had been quietly redistributed through the precision and patience Zoe had maintained. The soft hum of the office, the distant city noises, and the faint ambient echoes of movement blended to emphasize the layered dynamics of observation, insight, and quiet recalibration, each element contributing to the sustained tension and anticipation of understanding, acknowledgement, and the forthcoming resolution of influence. Ethan's exhale, long and measured, signaled comprehension, reflection, and acceptance, the quiet affirmation that Zoe's perceptive attention had reshaped the room's hierarchy, subtly yet decisively guiding perception, trust, and authority. Zoe's unwavering stance, deliberate gestures, and focused gaze anchored the scene, her presence projecting clarity, patience, and moral insight, every movement reinforcing the delicate but profound shift in the office dynamic, the sunlight reflecting off polished surfaces emphasizing the nuanced interplay of awareness, observation, and deliberate influence that now defined the space. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the soft light of late afternoon spilling across the conference room, casting long shadows over the polished marble floor and reflecting subtly on the edges of folders, documents, and the glass panels that lined the walls. Zoe Carter remained poised, her hands lightly resting on the table, her posture upright and unwavering, each movement calculated and deliberate, her eyes focused on the micro-expressions of Clara Belmont, noting the slight shifts in her breathing, the delicate tilts of her head, and the measured adjustments of her hands on the stack of papers before her. Clara's composure had softened, the subtle tightening of her lips and the barely perceptible furrow of her brow revealing an internal reckoning, an acknowledgement that her carefully maintained authority had been quietly challenged and observed, her dominance now reframed by the perceptive presence of Zoe. The office air was filled with a stillness that emphasized every minor sound, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint shuffle of papers, the gentle click of heels on the marble floor, each accentuating the careful rhythm of observation, consideration, and silent communication. Ethan's eyes followed Zoe's steady gaze, recognizing the precise clarity and moral awareness she brought to the situation, her subtle nods and measured gestures reinforcing the quiet authority she had established without a single overt command. The camera's faint red blink continued to mark each second, capturing every nuance, every micro-movement, and translating the careful interplay of attention and awareness into an unspoken narrative that dominated the atmosphere. Zoe adjusted a folder slightly, the soft tap echoing against the polished surface, a subtle yet intentional signal of focus, precision, and control that underscored the shift in dynamics within the room. Ethan's fingers traced lightly across the edge of the table, a grounding movement that mirrored the careful calibration of thought, observation, and judgment taking place, each breath deliberate and measured as he absorbed the layered understanding of the unfolding situation. Clara's subtle adjustments, the shifting of weight, the repositioning of hands, and the controlled inhalations and exhalations communicated her internal recognition that authority had been quietly redistributed, that influence now flowed through perception, attention, and insight rather than mere positional power. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, elongating reflections across the polished floor and casting a warm glow that highlighted the intricate interplay of light, shadow, and reflection, a visual metaphor for the subtle recalibration of power and awareness within the office. Ethan exhaled slowly, deliberate, each breath marking the acknowledgement of the quiet realignment of trust, insight, and authority, the depth of Zoe's observation reframing his perspective and influencing the trajectory of decision-making. Zoe's calm remained unwavering, her deliberate posture, precise glances, and subtle micro-movements projecting an aura of perceptive authority, every gesture reinforcing the careful balance of awareness and influence she had cultivated. Clara's eyes flicked between Ethan, Zoe, and the camera feed, the delicate widening of her gaze, the gentle lift of her eyebrows, and the subtle contraction of her jaw indicating the recognition of a shift in perception, an understanding that clarity and insight had redefined the room's dynamic. The office seemed suspended, each second elongated by the deliberate interplay of observation, reflection, and anticipation, the quiet orchestration of understanding and moral clarity resonating in the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. Ethan's gaze swept from the camera to Zoe and back to Clara, acknowledging the nuanced recalibration of attention, awareness, and influence, each movement a silent testament to the careful and deliberate unfolding of understanding and insight. Zoe's slight, controlled nod, the micro-adjustment of her stance, and the deliberate timing of her gestures reinforced the measured authority she had established, her presence a steadying anchor of clarity, focus, and perceptive awareness. The light shifted again, stretching shadows across the floor, highlighting the three-dimensional relationships within the room, emphasizing the delicate balance of observation, insight, and moral clarity that defined the moment. Ethan's hand brushed lightly over the surface of the table, a grounding gesture that reflected the absorption of nuanced information, careful consideration of the unfolding dynamic, and the acknowledgement of the shift in influence initiated by Zoe's perceptive presence. Clara's subtle movements, the deliberate repositioning of her hands, and the measured adjustment of posture signaled a tacit acknowledgement of the quiet recalibration of power, the recognition that influence was now determined not by position alone, but by observation, patience, and moral insight. The camera continued its silent, persistent blink, marking the passage of time, capturing micro-expressions, subtle gestures, and deliberate movements, translating them into an ongoing narrative of awareness, insight, and recalibrated authority. Ethan's eyes remained focused on Zoe, a combination of reflection, acknowledgement, and measured appreciation in his expression, understanding that her composed vigilance had transformed the dynamic of the office, subtly yet irrevocably shaping perception, trust, and influence. Zoe's calm presence, deliberate stance, and precise gestures continued to anchor the space, each micro-expression reinforcing the nuanced and quiet power of clarity, observation, and moral certainty. The sunlight reflecting off polished surfaces emphasizing the layered interplay of awareness and subtle authority that now governed the room. Ethan's gaze held steady on the camera feed, the blinking red light marking each second as if measuring the weight of attention, observation, and understanding within the office. Zoe Carter remained poised near the table, her shoulders squared, hands lightly resting on the polished surface, each gesture deliberate and measured, her calm presence acting as an anchor for the subtle but powerful shift in authority that had occurred over the course of the afternoon. Clara Belmont's posture was less rigid, her movements more tentative, fingers adjusting papers with calculated care, eyes flicking between Ethan, Zoe, and the camera feed, acknowledging silently that her prior dominance had been quietly and irrevocably recalibrated by insight, observation, and moral clarity. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows shifted slowly, elongating reflections across the marble floor, casting angular patterns that mirrored the subtle but precise recalibration of perception, attention, and influence in the room. Ethan exhaled deliberately, letting the slow, controlled breath mark a moment of reflection and comprehension, his fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood as his mind absorbed the full implications of Zoe's insight, the evidence revealed by the camera, and the unseen realignment of authority. Zoe's eyes met his briefly, a subtle nod passing between them, communicating trust, acknowledgement, and the unspoken assertion of clarity and perceptive authority that had become the foundation of the new dynamic. Clara's subtle movements, the slight tightening of her jaw, and the measured adjustment of her hands on the folders all reflected a tacit recognition of the shift, an internal acknowledgement that influence now resided not solely in position or status, but in awareness, observation, and moral certainty. The hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of paper, and the distant murmur of the city below created a soundscape that accentuated the stillness, drawing attention to the layered rhythm of observation, assessment, and deliberate focus that defined the atmosphere. Ethan's gaze swept from the camera to Zoe and back to Clara, noting the subtle micro-expressions, the shifting weight, and the careful positioning of hands and documents, every detail contributing to the quiet orchestration of understanding, trust, and the measured distribution of authority. Zoe's slight movements, the delicate tilt of her head, the subtle adjustment of posture, reinforced her presence as a stabilizing and guiding influence, projecting calm, insight, and moral awareness without a word raised. Clara's soft, controlled breathing, her gentle repositioning of a folder, and the careful alignment of her shoulders all indicated a growing awareness, a tacit acknowledgement that the equilibrium in the room had shifted and that observation, clarity, and perceptive insight now held a significant weight in the unfolding decisions. The sunlight continued to move across the office, highlighting the interplay of light and shadow, reflections on polished surfaces, and the subtle geometry of space that mirrored the recalibration of perception, awareness, and influence. Ethan's fingers traced small, deliberate patterns across the table, grounding himself as he considered the next steps, the implications of the evidence, and the quiet but undeniable presence of Zoe as a guiding force in the room. Zoe remained steadfast, her calm eyes observing every nuance, her posture deliberate, reinforcing the quiet power of focus, insight, and moral clarity that had subtly but irreversibly reshaped the dynamic of the office. Clara's eyes shifted repeatedly, registering the persistent certainty in Zoe's gaze and the controlled deliberation in Ethan's posture, her subtle movements now tempered by acknowledgement of the shift, the recognition that influence had been redistributed by awareness, perception, and careful attention to detail. The camera's steady red blink continued, a metronome of observation, capturing every subtle micro-expression, gesture, and movement, a silent witness to the quiet recalibration of trust, insight, and authority. Ethan's slow exhale, deliberate and controlled, underscored comprehension, reflection, and recognition of the new equilibrium, the weight of insight and observation now clearly established within the office space. Zoe's composed presence, subtle gestures, and focused gaze reinforced her anchoring influence, every movement and blink contributing to the careful, deliberate realignment of attention, awareness, and authority, the sunlight accentuating the layered interplay of observation and moral clarity that now defined the room. The office seemed to hold its breath, each detail magnified, each reflection and shadow emphasizing the deliberate and nuanced orchestration of insight, patience, and perception, a quiet but powerful testament to the transformation that Zoe's presence had effected in the subtle hierarchy of trust and influence. Ethan's attention lingered on the feed, the room, and Zoe's steady presence, absorbing the depth of understanding, the quiet shifts in posture, and the meticulous attention to detail that had guided the recalibration of authority and perception, leaving Clara's tentative awareness and measured response as the final confirmation of a space transformed by clarity, insight, and moral awareness. Ethan's gaze held steady on the camera feed, the blinking red light marking each second as if measuring the weight of attention, observation, and understanding within the office. Zoe Carter remained poised near the table, her shoulders squared, hands lightly resting on the polished surface, each gesture deliberate and measured, her calm presence acting as an anchor for the subtle but powerful shift in authority that had occurred over the course of the afternoon. Clara Belmont's posture was less rigid, her movements more tentative, fingers adjusting papers with calculated care, eyes flicking between Ethan, Zoe, and the camera feed, acknowledging silently that her prior dominance had been quietly and irrevocably recalibrated by insight, observation, and moral clarity. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows shifted slowly, elongating reflections across the marble floor, casting angular patterns that mirrored the subtle but precise recalibration of perception, attention, and influence in the room. Ethan exhaled deliberately, letting the slow, controlled breath mark a moment of reflection and comprehension, his fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood as his mind absorbed the full implications of Zoe's insight, the evidence revealed by the camera, and the unseen realignment of authority. Zoe's eyes met his briefly, a subtle nod passing between them, communicating trust, acknowledgement, and the unspoken assertion of clarity and perceptive authority that had become the foundation of the new dynamic. Clara's subtle movements, the slight tightening of her jaw, and the measured adjustment of her hands on the folders all reflected a tacit recognition of the shift, an internal acknowledgement that influence now resided not solely in position or status, but in awareness, observation, and moral certainty. The hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of paper, and the distant murmur of the city below created a soundscape that accentuated the stillness, drawing attention to the layered rhythm of observation, assessment, and deliberate focus that defined the atmosphere. Ethan's gaze swept from the camera to Zoe and back to Clara, noting the subtle micro-expressions, the shifting weight, and the careful positioning of hands and documents, every detail contributing to the quiet orchestration of understanding, trust, and the measured distribution of authority. Zoe's slight movements, the delicate tilt of her head, the subtle adjustment of posture, reinforced her presence as a stabilizing and guiding influence, projecting calm, insight, and moral awareness without a word raised. Clara's soft, controlled breathing, her gentle repositioning of a folder, and the careful alignment of her shoulders all indicated a growing awareness, a tacit acknowledgement that the equilibrium in the room had shifted and that observation, clarity, and perceptive insight now held a significant weight in the unfolding decisions. The sunlight continued to move across the office, highlighting the interplay of light and shadow, reflections on polished surfaces, and the subtle geometry of space that mirrored the recalibration of perception, awareness, and influence. Ethan's fingers traced small, deliberate patterns across the table, grounding himself as he considered the next steps, the implications of the evidence, and the quiet but undeniable presence of Zoe as a guiding force in the room. Zoe remained steadfast, her calm eyes observing every nuance, her posture deliberate, reinforcing the quiet power of focus, insight, and moral clarity that had subtly but irreversibly reshaped the dynamic of the office. Clara's eyes shifted repeatedly, registering the persistent certainty in Zoe's gaze and the controlled deliberation in Ethan's posture, her subtle movements now tempered by acknowledgement of the shift, the recognition that influence had been redistributed by awareness, perception, and careful attention to detail. The camera's steady red blink continued, a metronome of observation, capturing every subtle micro-expression, gesture, and movement, a silent witness to the quiet recalibration of trust, insight, and authority. Ethan's slow exhale, deliberate and controlled, underscored comprehension, reflection, and recognition of the new equilibrium, the weight of insight and observation now clearly established within the office space. Zoe's composed presence, subtle gestures, and focused gaze reinforced her anchoring influence. Every movement and blink contributing to the careful, deliberate realignment of attention, awareness, and authority, the sunlight accentuating the layered interplay of observation and moral clarity that now defined the room. The office seemed to hold its breath, each detail magnified, each reflection and shadow emphasizing the deliberate and nuanced orchestration of insight, patience, and perception, a quiet but powerful testament to the transformation that Zoe's presence had effected in the subtle hierarchy of trust and influence. Ethan's attention lingered on the feed, the room, and Zoe's steady presence, absorbing the depth of understanding, the quiet shifts in posture, and the meticulous attention to detail that had guided the recalibration of authority and perception, leaving Clara's tentative awareness and measured response as the final confirmation of a space transformed by clarity, insight, and moral awareness.